start with a couple of more topical questions, things that have been in the news this year. One thing that I think the entire entertainment industry has been dealing with is this issue of violence in media. And it trickles down to the TV realm, mostly on the networks, but even on pay cable or basic cable. And I'm just curious what you guys think when you see this debate going on, and your shows, some of them do feature violence to certain levels. What kind of responsibility do you feel when you're creating those shows? We'll start with Kevin.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've kind of gotten this one a couple of times.
I imagine this is not new.
Well, and also I've been sort of like sketchy about trying to not engage in the big discussion, because you don't want your show to sort of fall into this huge big violence discussion. And you know what? I don't know, in terms of responsibility, it's a hard question, because it's everything that happens affects. Yes, when children watch violent television, there's tests and studies done. It makes them more aggressive. It makes them, it affects them. So I think it really is up to adults to monitor their children's viewing habits. The show I'm making, The Following, is not for children. Children should not be watching it. The parents should turn the TV off or turn the channel to something a little less violent. But the question is there a responsibility? Well, I want to tell my stories. I grew up watching every violent show known to man. It's violence in fiction has been around forever. It's like the entire sort of send-up of The Following is Edgar Allan Poe. We're telling, we're just sort of robbing from, the motifs and symbolism and allegories of Poe, which was particularly horrific and gory, if you go back and read Poe. And that's the fun and kitsch of the show, is that, we're sort of playing with that. And I just want to tell my stories, and I want to do, it's fiction, it's not reality. And I think going out in the street and breathing affects the choices we make in life. I think there's a bigger issue at play, mental illness, which I'm glad has finally come to the surface. And I think, those people should not be watching The Following, for sure. How do I get them not to watch it? I don't know. It's a big issue. Is there a responsibility? Sure. But I'm a writer, and I want to tell my stories. So shouldn't I be able to do that, is my question. I don't have an answer. It's a complicated issue. It's hard to, discuss in sort of this scenario. It's you're just going to get a soundbite out of me, and then someone's going to twist it and turn it and make it sound awful. So.
But what do you guys think about that? What do you think about that question about the responsibility?
Well, I've been appalled by the violence on the Newsroom this past season. It's really shocking.
People slamming in the glass. I think that obviously with the only thing anybody has to fear if you watch too much of the Newsroom or really anything I write is you're going to start singing Gilbert and Sullivan. That your kids are going to be influenced that way. But I think we can all empathize with Kevin that he wants to tell his stories. I think it's interesting though that something that isn't discussed in terms of Hollywood's influence on the culture is that, don't you guys think that we also created the mythology that so many people, and I don't want to make this a political discussion, but so many people, particularly on the right, want to restore America to this thing that it never was. We just pretended that it was. Whether it was that World War II was a very glamorous war, or that African Americans are docile, subservient people who occasionally impart wisdom, or that father knows best, that kind of thing. Didn't we create that myth also, as well as glamorizing violence?
Well, sure, I think that's one way. that's one really great point, thank you. And I will latch onto that forever and ever from this moment forward. But, I grew up watching all this stuff, and I sort of feel like fiction is the place I can take these thoughts and these ideas, and I can sort of let them out. I don't go out into the real world and create violence. I'm squeamish. The sight of blood terrifies me and makes me sick in my stomach. So, I don't watch horror movies anymore because I've grown into that old man who has a tough stomach, has a sensitive stomach. So, but you're right. There's a myth. There's a myth to all of this.
I mean, it's a big part of the culture. Violence is a big part of entertainment. It's Poe, the westerns. The big part of the English language culture of entertainment. Charles Dickens, whatever. There's violence in it. I feel like I question a little bit how much watching violence makes people violent who are not naturally violent. You know, I don't see any more, you know, during the Crusades, the only entertainment people had were plays and stained glass windows, and there's horrific atrocities being committed. I don't want to absolve us of responsibility, and I have children, but I guard my TV. And there's something about, I had an experience of having the TV on and watching, you know, one time everything was rated G that was in Hollywood. And watching, I think the movie might have been Anzio with my son, who was at the time 5 or 6 years old. And we had really, you know, stuck him in the world of like Barney and Thomas the Train and other things that have other issues that are, but that are not violence, but different, you know, categories of unrelated to real human experience. And there was this burst of like machine gun fire, and someone fell over. And there's no blood in this movie. It's just people. There's no squibs really, anything. And my son was watching, and he goes, "Ow!" And I thought, well, that is a natural response to watching someone getting shot. And somehow his innocence had been sort of preserved on that. And then, you know, cut to, you know, now he's 16 years old, and he's, you know, playing a video game where it's literally more points for shooting somebody in the head. I don't have the stomach for it. Even working on The Sopranos, you know, there was some competitive part of me that wanted to write a brutal, violent scene and to capture who these people are and their sort of disrespect for human life and the powerlessness of having someone, you know, beat you who just because they're bigger than you. But I don't like torture. I don't like it as a device for tension. But that's my personal taste. I agree with Kevin. It's like people should keep. That there are age restrictions on these things. I'm on a channel, our show is TV 14, it's not TV mature. The stranger thing to me is people have a very high tolerance for violence, blowing people's heads off, shooting them in the face, all these other things, and they have no, you know, it's the joke about that you can show somebody cutting off a breast, but you can't show a baby breastfeeding. That's sort of the more peculiar thing to me. But
I agree,
you know,
because that's true.
Well, I mean, Matt raises a great point. Shakespeare, the Greeks, way more gory and violent than anything that we're up to. And, you know, I think it's interesting that people focus so much on physical violence, and what they don't talk about is ideological violence. I mean, what makes Birth of a Nation such a troubling movie? It's not the physical violence that's happening in it. It's like the anti-Semitism and racism within that movie, which is way more destructive than the physical violence that you see. I mean, you know, great movies like The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, no one's sitting around saying, you know, why are those so violent, and have they ruined a generation of children? You know, I mean, I find the sort of double standards kind of laughable. Like, people had no problem saying House of Cards with some of the ways people behaved or ended up emotionally or physically violent with one another. But, you know, we kill a dog in the first 30 seconds, and people freaked out about that. You know, like, you kill an animal, you can kill as many human beings as you want in 30 seconds, and no one gives a crap. But you kill an animal, you don't even show it on screen, and people flip out. You know, so
there really was a backlash.
Oh, there's a few. I mean,
it's the worst thing you can do. We didn't kill the dog, but we had a dog disappear, and people were very upset.
We killed a horse, and people were not happy about a dead horse. Yeah. We didn't actually kill a horse.
Yeah, right. But
no,
you know,
horse is harmed.
I will say that it is a little different now, because the technology has increased to the point that I think that I'm always shocked by it. I think there's the audience has an appetite for viscera that I don't remember. You know, the technology is so advanced in terms of showing the internal organs and the splatter and all these other things, and it can be a really jarring experience if you're not prepared for it. But it's an adult environment.
Where does that appetite come from?
I think that they're powerless and they want revenge, and everything that runs on revenge right now is very exciting to audiences. I think it's the most surefire commercial arena that there is somebody getting physical revenge on somebody bad.
And that's a big part of Homeland.
Well,
I didn't judge it. I didn't judge it.
I would say that there is a line, though, don't you guys think?
that there's a line at which things start to feel gratuitous, and I think all of us, it's incumbent upon
Well, I think there's a
all of
line
us.
at which, especially with the gore, there's a line beyond which it starts to work against itself and become comedic and look like The Evil Dead 2, and it looks, it becomes
Yes,
splatterfest.
absolutely.
And it actually
I cut
becomes
things all the time because they're
Yeah.
just too bloody, and
And
it
I
just
mean,
looks fake, and it just doesn't feel right to
I
the
think
story. It takes away.
I think that violence in the real world, as people have pointed out here, is awful to witness and difficult to witness. And I think that it's the sanitized versions of violence on television in a way are worse because they're letting kids watch. I mean, on network television, people will die in droves all the time. They just die in a way that is clean and easy to watch, and it makes it fun.
That's
and it
right.
Makes it's more like a video game, like the old video games that where you didn't even see anything.
It was interesting. Yesterday, and when this comes out, yesterday is going to be about 2 months ago. But yesterday in a basketball game, a Louisville basketball player was terribly injured. There was just the bone came out.
Worse than Theismann.
And worse than Theismann is right. You couldn't look at it, and you could see shots of the players on the bench covering their eyes with their jerseys because they couldn't look at it. So what's the disconnect there? That happened, and that was real violence. It wasn't intentional violence, obviously, but that was a real injury. People couldn't look at it. But how come an hour later on one of our shows they can look at something much worse?
Because they know they're watching fiction. I mean, it's I think that's just the when you're sitting yourself in front of the television. There's something unreal about it ultimately. I mean, you want to suspend your disbelief and you want to become involved in the show and the characters, but ultimately what's happening on the screen to you, there's a veil between your experience of it and reality. That's why I think reality shows now are so popular, is people actually think that they're watching something that's really happening, and there's something visceral and immediate about that we can't really get close to.
You could go on the internet right now and for the rest of the day watch real decapitations, watch real shootings, real car accidents. You can see someone's head cut off with a chainsaw for real. And that's readily available. I mean, on posting boards you have gore threads where people have a fetish for this sort of thing. I mean, at least in drama or comedy or what have you, I mean, there's thought and narrative and framing and put into it, and in terms of one's responsibility, as to how violence is portrayed, I mean, I think the only responsibility is telling a good story, as Kevin mentioned.
It goes back to what these guys said. I mean, if you want to start indicting violence in fiction, you have to go, you're indicting the cornerstones of our culture. You're indicting the Iliad, you're indicting the Bible, you're indicting Shakespeare. Things happen in the Bible that you could not show on HBO or anywhere.
Because they're too expensive.
Because they're just too expensive, except for the History Channel.
Isn't there also an element, too, that violence cloaked in fantasy, say on Game of Thrones, versus the following? The following seems like it could actually happen, whereas Game of Thrones is clearly this fantasy world.
You never know what a disturbed person will latch onto. It could be anything. And but that said, those of us who are, we're all trying to, audiences watch entertainment. This is a mystery to us also. Some sociologists could explain this better. But for someone who's rooted in reality, and trying to recapture reality in whatever way, which most of us are, no matter what the story level is, you want the interactions and the behavior to be realistic because you're working with people. And there's a certain point where you look at American culture is a violent culture. Our genre is the gangster genre. People have guns in their homes. They have, not in the 1860s, but right now. And when you look at the violent aspect of our culture and the weapons that are available to regular people, and then you throw in some kind of and I will just say the word disturbed. I'm not even going to say mentally disturbed. I don't even want to categorize it and be, pigeonholed or what else is. But disturbed people will latch onto anything, and it can, and so for me, like the idea, we have to control things. And so when someone from the NRA comes out and starts talking about entertainment, and I was saying, entertainment is another fetish for these people. Who knows if it's even an influence on, no matter what they say. Their access to weapons in reality is not related to anything we're talking about. Somebody, that's the part where I sort of get annoyed about it. And I think what it is, and I completely identify it with it as a parent, is there's a frustration about how much is going on. It's not really shown on television, the results of these things. And, just having worked in the 60s, as an entertainer, but going through this stuff recently, the war was on TV constantly, the assassinations, anything that was filmed was on TV. None of that is really shown to them anymore. And that is satisfying to me on one level. On the other hand, as a parent, you're sort of frustrated and you're saying, well, what can I tell my kid? What is it like when the news is filled with these, atrocious events? They're completely random. There's fame given to the people who do the murders, which is really the real currency of our society. I wish that would be stopped somehow. And so where are you going to look? Well, there's a bunch of people who are making entertainment and they are fascinated with this. We are all fascinated with violence. And I'm not just talking about the people here, but it's a cultural fascination for us. Might makes right. Do you have the guts to who is a violent person, who's not a violent person? What are the extraordinary circumstances under which regular people are capable of violence? All of that is drama, and it's human experience. And, whether you're watching Cops or you're watching the Newsroom, there is always the threat of violence when there's human interaction. So it's kind of, I identify with the parent and people that says, somebody shut that down, they have to be more responsible. But this is literally the last place, I think, on some level that's really responsible for it. We're a reflection of it, honestly.
And for better or for worse, we often engender the conversation in the popular culture about these issues. One of the most fascinating times I ever had in working TV was on 24, when 24 became this lightning rod for the debate about torture. It was such an interesting thing, and if you look back on thrillers over the years, torture is a fundamental part of every thriller story. Someone has a piece of information, you have to get it out of them. The clock is ticking. How do you do it? James Bond, exactly. So it was so interesting to see how the show, which was using tropes that were ages old, all of a sudden became this a lightning rod for a conversation about it. And I think that's a great thing. I think so. There is a line that you can cross, but popular culture, I think we have an obligation at some level to raise these issues and to talk about them openly.
Well, and that was post 9/11.
Right.
Clearly, we were trying to figure out a way to cope with what had just happened, and that show became that lightning rod. Yeah.
All right, separate issue. One of the other things in the TV business this year that's come up a lot is there's been a lot of movement atop shows. Different showrunners come in, different showrunners have been ousted. Shows like Community and Walking Dead and others have experienced some change there. I know Homeland, you guys have had a little bit of change bringing in some writers. As the people running these shows, how do you guys deal with that kind of change? And do you see this as a trend, or is there less power given to the person who's running the show to see their vision from start to middle to end?
Let you know after they fire us.
I know, right? I was saying I don't have
far.
much experience in that area. I haven't really been a part of a show where there's been sort of that's ever happened. So
I do find that with us, the continuity of having the same people at the beginning through to the further stages of the process is helpful, because anytime somebody new comes in, you're for that person you're rewinding the clock and starting over. Whereas I feel that we, not just David and I, but the machine as a whole, refines itself each successive season, and it's a steep learning curve of doing the show that we're doing any show, and you learn a shorthand that increases efficiencies and makes the show incrementally better, hopefully each season that you go. And I would imagine that starting over can shake things up and introduce fresh blood, but it can also, it's starting over.
What is it? Success has 1,000 fathers, failure has none. I think when the show starts to work, there is a mystery about why it's working. And, I joined The Sopranos in the 5th season. There have been a lot of people in and out of there, and the idea that someone other than David would be involved in that show and that you would get anything like what that show was a mistake. I like to think I made a contribution. I know Terry made a contribution. No one does it alone, but that was a joke. And I think part of why that show was as good as it was because he was there the entire time. It was very personal to him. and it was inspired by his energy and his focus, despite everything else. And it's a group effort. I mean, there's hundreds of people running these things. So for me, I am always curious what will happen. I think that, you know, if the show, it depends on what kind of show it is, but I think certain shows require that personality, and I think that the commercial value of the show has to do with that person.
But on your network, you know, the idea of anyone other than you doing Mad Men seems ludicrous. Yet on AMC, they've gone through.
They called you, right? No, he was great. They threaten a lot.
I was going to say they must threaten because on Walking Dead they've had 3 guys do that now, and the show still has great reviews. The ratings are better than ever. So
well, we don't know. We don't know. And I would say that it's very hard to be that. You know, when they were threatening to get rid of me it was always like, you know, I knew someone would take that job. There's no doubt in my mind. I would not want that job, but I knew someone would take that job. And so that wasn't the issue, like, are you replaceable? Anybody thinks they're not replaceable is crazy. But it will become...
Did they really approach you?
No.
No, they did not.
He wrote me an email to tell me that they didn't know whatever they said.
I would definitely watch an episode of Mad Men written by Sorkin.
It was very meaningful to me because it was at a very low point. I was like, oh man.
No, I had either read something or heard something, so I just got in touch with Matt right away to say it isn't happening and it won't ever happen, and this is your show and don't be ridiculous. I can tell you that, you know, I left The West Wing after the 4th season. It ran for 7 seasons, and I left after the 4th. And almost as soon as the press release went out saying that I was leaving, I got a call from Larry David, who had left Seinfeld before Seinfeld was over. And he said, listen to me, under no circumstances can you ever watch the show again. Either it's going to be great and you're going to be miserable, or it's going to be less than great and you're going to be miserable. But either way, you're going to be miserable. And I thought, well, you know, it's Larry David. He's kind of professionally miserable. And so at the beginning of the 5th season, Warner Brothers, a few days before the 5th season premiere, sent over a DVD of what would be episode 89, the first episode that I didn't write. And I put it in, and I can't tell you whether it was great or less than great, because it was less than 30 seconds after it started that I dove at the DVD player and slammed it off, because it was like watching somebody make out with my girlfriend. It was so difficult to watch, and again, not because of the quality. It could well have been great, and likely was, given the people who were doing it. But it was just so difficult to watch these characters in this world that I had created, no longer needing me at all, just doing it by themselves. So I've never seen an episode of The West Wing beyond season 4.
You know what? It's not The West Wing, but I had the same experience with Dawson's Creek.
Yeah.
After the 2nd season, I left the show, and you know, and Greg Berlanti, who I had sort of empowered to be the guy who take over the show, but I couldn't watch it anymore. It hurt. It was my personal story. It was my growing up. It was my life.
Right.
And I couldn't watch it. It hurt too much. And I have to this day not seen every episode of Dawson's Creek, because I haven't seen Scream 3. I finally had to watch Scream 3 because I didn't write it, and it hurt. Mm-hmm. And I finally had to watch it when I did Scream 4. Big mistake. Because it just was torture.
I can assure both you guys that when you get fired from a job, you feel the same way. You just don't watch it after you're let go.
Beau, you're sort of new to the showrunner game, as it were. And what's been the most surprising part of this job, or the most difficult part of this job that you didn't anticipate?
The most difficult part I totally anticipated, but I don't think I could have imagined how challenging it would be, which is just the sheer titanic size of the effort. I mean, it's a form of insanity. It's the equivalent of making 7 movies in 1 year, and for some folks, twice that. You know, and you know, Aaron and I were just talking before this got started about the blessing and curse of that, which is, you know, there's a certain speed that you have no choice over. I mean, you have to create 800 pages or more, and there are dates when it's going to be shot, and those are fairly inflexible. And so you have to rely on instincts a lot, which liberates you at times from self-doubt and self-loathing because you can't luxuriate in that. The downside is you make mistakes. I mean, when you are relying so much on the fumes of instinct, you will falter and stumble. And sometimes those mistakes are surprising and interesting and lead to a new place. But now having kind of been through the gauntlet once, looking back at season 1, all I see is the mistakes. And I don't beat myself up about that. And Matt's right. Hundreds of people contribute, and because it's a collaborative thing, you can't heap that all on yourself. We all share in the endeavor, but and I don't think anything catastrophic happened. But submerges the show at any point. But it's just fucking exhausting. More than anything,
and the instinct thing too. I mean, you talk about there's a train coming at you, so your instinct is to run out of the way, and you really can't. And there are people, who at a certain point you're not. I always am marveling at there's almost like a lack of. You're not an organism anymore in a weird way, because you're writing all the time, and you're editing and you're casting, depending on how involved you are. And ours is a fairly compressed schedule. We don't do 22 or 24, so I definitely have that going. But it's very compressed. The show still shoots in 8 days, and it's all at once. And I say there's a certain point in the season where I get into bed at night and I literally hear, oh, this is the part where the guy goes to sleep. Where you're literally just outside of yourself, in this sort of psychosis, because you're just living in that all the time. But you also get pampered in a strange way. And then when there is a getting out of jail part of it, where you all of a sudden at the end of the season you got $5 in your pocket and a new suit, and you're kind of how do I function? And
right,
I got to go get a job.
I'm with Beau. The schedule is ferocious and it's exhausting, but a lot of people have exhausting jobs and aren't rewarded nearly as much as we are. The part of the schedule for me, and this is the only part of doing television that I don't like. I love doing series television. And in fact, I love the immediacy of it. I love that if I were writing a screenplay right now and wrote a joke today and everything went perfectly, I would hear the laugh 2 years from now. But I'm writing a television script right now. That's going to be on the air in a couple of months. And I love that immediacy. I love working with the same group of people every week. I love that we're telling a big story, kind of chapter by chapter. But the part that is really tough is that when you're not writing well, and for me, that's more often than not. Writing well, if I'm having a good writing day, or I can put 2 or 3 good writing days in a row together, that's a winning streak. That's an anomaly. Most of the time, I'm not writing well. With television, when you're not writing, with a movie, if you're not writing well, you can call the studio, the producer, the director, whoever is waiting for it, like we talked about, and say, I know I said I'd have it next month. It's going to be 3 months from now. It's not going well. You have hard deadlines. You have air dates with a television show. And when you're not writing well, you have to write anyway. You have to write when you're not writing well, then point a camera at it and then show it to millions of people. With no disclaimer at the beginning saying, sorry, I just wasn't writing well this week. It's not going to be a good one. You have to do that. So, there's stage fright that goes along with this.
I think one of the coolest things was being, and I think it's much closer to the way theater works than film, is being able to respond to what you're seeing in front of the cameras and adapt. Evolve scripts later on down the line. For instance, the whole Russo running for governor storyline in House of Cards was a whole other character that we hadn't cast yet and hadn't gotten to, and Corey Stahl was doing such a great job in the first few episodes. I thought, well, it's a monumental amount of work it required a lot of page 1 rewrites, but shift that whole story to him. But even though we were moving fast, since that was a few weeks or months ahead, we could do that. We could stay ahead of it, and yeah.
You can adapt. You can adapt if something is. That's why I try never to break more than the first 5 at once, because you want to adapt. You see stuff come in, you cast people, they score and you didn't expect them to, or they seem more interesting, or can't stop talking about them in the room.
Give us an example of something like that from Mad Men. Something where the storyline went to a place with a character that you didn't anticipate.
Duck. Mark Moses came in as the end of the first season. I didn't even know if there was going to be more. We had to hire an accounts man, and created this character. And Mark is a really gifted actor, and there's a certain point when you're casting at this point where you're just you just want the presence. Like saying somebody's in charge of a corporation is a different thing, or a boss, than actually seeing an actor that on camera feels like they're a powerful person. And it has nothing to do with experience. It's just some kind of chemical thing at some point. Maybe it is experience, I don't know. But anyway, Mark came on for a couple of episodes, and I watched the dailies, and I got this. It was the last 2 episodes of the first season, and I didn't even know if there'd be more of the show. And I got this flood of response from people in advertising who had not said a word about the show, saying, "You finally have an account man on the show." Because they were all annoyed that Don was so good looking, and there's no all the creatives look more like me than like Don Draper, and that, he looked like an account man to whatever else is. And they saw Mark Moses and saw Duck and heard the way he talked and his vests and all his being in Alcoholics Anonymous, all this other stuff. He just rang true, and he ended up becoming this gigantic character on the show. He was the major conflict of the second season. People come in for a line, and they just become something, So
did that happen on Homeland at all?
Often, over and over again. But in kind of more, almost in a more profound way, because we didn't even know at the beginning of the year that Brody and Carrie would spend time in each other's company, very often. And the episode where they actually did, I think it was the 3rd or 4th episode of the first season, all of a sudden these 2 actors, walked on the stage together, and it was, I remember seeing the dailies, and just, the word chemistry was just flashing on the top of the screen. And I said, well, we're going to have to completely figure out a way to put them in each other's company in a way that we hadn't planned to before. It did involve exactly what you guys are talking about, which is we had to go back and look at the scripts that we'd already written, and figure out a new way to tell the story.
I didn't know Roger and Don were friends until episode 9. When Don was going to leave and get another job elsewhere, someone said, "Why is he staying there?" I'm like, "Because it's such schmuck bait. He's being offered a job. He's going to leave this." I didn't realize at the time that I could get rid of the set and all the actors and everything and just start over if I had to. And they go, "Well, he's friends with Roger." And I'm like, they are friends, aren't they? I didn't even know that. I love the scenes together. Can I just say one thing, too, when we talk about how hard this job is? The one thing that I've realized, now I'm on season 6 of my show, which I think makes me the senior person in terms of how long they've been doing this. It may not be as many, but I have a newfound gratitude for, Aaron has this incredible feature career or whatever, but I have not gotten used to the fact, after having struggled for a long time, that everything that I write will get shot. And that is and will get read within a few hours, because I pay people that they have to read it right away, and will get cast. As scary as that is, what for a writer in this medium, or in any medium, playwright, whatever, to know that your stuff is going to get shot, that is a luxury that I will never get used to, and I'm sure I will miss.
No, it's 100%, except for the last thing you said, 100% right.
One of the things is I write a script, and then you realize only upon writing it what it exactly doesn't need to be, and then you throw it out and start over again, and then I'm shooting it the next day. Some of that happens, and that's the panic. That's the panic of being a showrunner.
I'm a procrastinator, but I think that would kill me.
It does kill you, but it's a first-year show. It always evens out.
I don't know. I've only done this once. I can't even imagine the psychosis that I had the first season of the show.
Yeah, it's suicidal.
I can't believe you're standing and have hair and everything.
I had a question for Dan. You're the only person here, I believe, who's adapting someone else's work, obviously source material. I'm so obsessed with how are you parsing out what elements of that book? It looks like we have a mic situation.
And what's happening to Dan right now?
Basically, the question is adapting existing source material, the responsibility you have to stay true to it, and
And
do
also,
your own
I
thing.
know George Martin is a producer on your show too. How intimately involved is he in guiding you through this dense?
He's a tremendous resource for the show. Obviously, we're all living in his dream to a certain extent, but for us, we knew this going in. As many readers as George had going in, which is a fair amount. It was a nice. With most, I would say at the beginning of The Sopranos, there are precisely 0 people who come to a show like The Sopranos or a show like Mad Men wanting to know what's happening to Don Draper. You have to make them want to know what's what's going to happen to Don Draper. We had a buffer in that way. It was a blessing. It was great. We knew that there was at least a core group of people who would be interested in what we were doing, no matter how badly we fucked it up. We also knew that that number of people was not nearly large enough to justify what we were doing. We needed to make a show that everybody could watch, or if not everybody, a much larger. We reached far beyond our core group of people, and that meant that 10 times out of 10, if we were having to make a choice between staying true to the letter of the source material and staying true to what was best for the show, we 10 times out of 10 have to choose what's best for the show. For us, that often involves radical compression and condensation because the books are massive, and the show is complicated, but the show is a tremendous simplification of something even more complicated. And ultimately, 10 hours is a fair amount of time to tell a story, but it's still only 10 hours.
How many novels has he written?
He's written 5. And
God, what I would do for 5 700-page novels.
I was thinking the same thing.
I mean, really, honestly. I know it's hard.
But Aaron, you're doing the same thing with the Steve Jobs book. You're taking that down and doing your own thing with that, right?
I'm doing my own thing with it, and Walter Isaacson wrote a great biography of Steve Jobs, but it's a cradle-to-grave biography, and it's a great piece of journalism. The movie will be something else entirely.
I have to give a shout out to Lord Michael Dobbs, who actually wrote the books that House of Cards was based on, the BBC version, which Andrew Davies wrote amazing scripts for, and Ian Richardson knocked out of the cricket park. That's an incredible miniseries, and anyone who is slightly interested or even hates our show should watch that one.
I mean, you guys, it's an interesting, different experience where you guys are coming from like foreign formats. What's that process?
Well, that was the BBC version of House of Cards was 3 parts of 4.
Right.
It was that sort of British model where 4 episodes comprises a season, and each one of those was based on a different book.
Are they longer? Are they like 70 minutes or something?
No,
They're just
4 hours. Yeah. So they moved very quickly. And the tone of the BBC version is much more tongue-in-cheek. I mean, obviously, because the story is so much more compressed. They're not doing as much character development and stuff like that in those. And TV was just a lot different in 1990. It was one of the first examples of an anti-hero, which I think all of us have indulged in to varying degrees. 1990, that was a rare thing on television. I mean, and now it's become really the thing in television. But we same thing, 10 out of 10. Whenever we have to serve the story for our show, we leave the BBC version behind, and really beyond the first couple episodes, I mean, there's almost zero overlap at all. We are all professional thieves. We'll steal from everywhere and everything. But adapting something, you do for a moment, you're like, I've been on the other side of the tracks too, and there's, a kind of responsibility, but ultimately, I mean...
I think it was Steve Martin who compared the process of adaptation to a failed marriage. Where he said that everybody starts out in love and with the best of intentions, and then you run into rocky waters, and you're trying to make it work, and you know it can work, and at a certain point, either amicably or otherwise, you realize that the source material and what you're doing need to kind of
I can still remember reading the first script of Hatufim, which is the Israeli format that Homeland is based on, and I had this euphoria because I realized that all we had to do was change Chaim and Nimrod to Nick and Jessica, and we'd be just fine. And of course, it didn't turn out that way at all. I mean, you're in exactly the same thing. We realized quite quickly that 2 POWs returning back to Israel was a very different proposition than a POW coming back in America. I mean, those figures, they are really national figures in Israel. And so you could create whole stories around the fact that they were public people and that they represented certain debates and issues that were going on in that country that was very, very different from what was happening in America. So I imagine you had the same thing with the English thing.
As corny as it sounds, I mean, each show has to find its own voice. And the voice is way more powerful than the narrative mechanics of whatever you're adapting. That's what people actually connect with, because that's what the actors connect with. And really, the only reason we exist is so that actors can have something to do, because people like to watch actors.
Now, I don't know the BBC version, but did Kevin Spacey's character narrate the show? as well?
There was direct address. We definitely stole that, and from the very earliest conversations, it was something.
I find that
we
so
wanted.
fascinating. And so, how involved is Kevin Spacey when you?
Kevin's an executive producer, and he's, as an actor, I mean, he's incredibly insightful and diligent, but a deep respect for the text. I mean, that which comes out of the theater world. So when he and I will talk about a direct address or a scene, or if we're in rehearsal, it always comes first out of, I want to understand. I want to understand what's happening here because I don't quite understand it yet. And oftentimes, what that will make eminently clear to me is that the scene's not well written, you know. And so we'll have a conversation about it, but it's not about this needs to change or demands or anything like that. It's very collaborative.
I love the relationship between Robin Wright and Kevin Spacey.
Well, I mean, they save our ass constantly. I mean, they're just, and Robin's incredible in that she's one of the few actors I've ever met who wants as least lines as possible because she knows what she can do between them. And you just stick a camera on her face and the layers that will come up if you give her enough to start with. Are way more powerful than any words you can put in her mouth.
By year 3, they all want the least lines. Don't worry.
I
can make this work.
If we asked your writers in your writers' room to give us a fair critique of each of you, what would your writers tell us?
I think some would hate me and some would love me. You know?
But specifics, what would they say are their strengths and weaknesses?
Or most frustrating about working with
what's
you?
most frustrating about working with you?
Control freak. I don't know. I don't know. There's always, you know, a situation where you find 3 or 4 writers that you just fall in love with because they're on your wavelength and they just so understand what you're trying to do and what you're about. And then you find yourself sort of navigating towards them and just sort of doing it all. And then there's always the 1 or 2 that get left out because maybe they were a talented, amazing writer that weren't right for the show. And so.
Or personalities.
Yeah, but I mean, I kind of try to get along with everybody. I mean, I've worked with some really crazy people in my day, so you've kind of learned to sort of tap dance with anybody. I don't mind a personality dispute. I just want you to write a great script. You deliver a great script. I don't care about your personality. I'll dance with you. But I don't know. I think I'm controlling. I have control issues.
How about you?
Well, my writer's room is an unusual writer's room. Generally speaking, well, I won't talk about other people's writer's room. What happens in mine is people, when I'm interviewing people for the job, I'm hiring mostly young, new writers. And the reason why is because I don't want people who are going to be frustrated by not writing. And frankly, people who can write aren't going to come looking for a job on my show anyway, because they can and they will write on somebody else's show. So I'm looking for really bright people who had an interesting writing sample, whose background is interesting to me, who think differently than I do. I absolutely try to surround myself with people who are smarter than I am, and certainly people who think differently than I do, who will see this job as a 1 or 2 year paid apprenticeship, before which they know that I'll do everything I can to place them at a show where they will be able to do more writing. But then once you have that room, you want people to feel ownership of the show. You want them to feel some kind of pride of authorship for the show. First of all, the room's going to be more fun that way, and you're going to get their best work from them that way. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, and it's understandable when people get a little frustrated that they don't feel like they're being able to contribute to the show. But like Kevin said, if you staff up with 8-10 people at the beginning of the season, you're keeping your fingers crossed most of the time. And if you, by the middle of the season, if 3 of them are very valuable to you, that was a good haul. You did well, and then you're going to hang on to those 3 people for the rest of your life, if you can. You will give them, and they know it. You'll give them whatever they want. They will become, executive producers of the show, and then you go looking for other people.
You try to find 1 or 2 more as you stumble along, but yes, if you find someone that you just really connect with, you don't let them go, and you hold on to them.
But I think, if you're asking what's the bad thing that people will say, probably it's going back to the schedule. You know, we start shooting an episode week after next that I haven't started writing yet, and it's a whole year of that. It's a whole year of constantly feeling like you have a term paper due. You know, that feeling that we all had in school. And when the script is finished, you're happy for 2 minutes. Really, you feel that euphoria for 2 minutes before all it means is you haven't started the next one. It's really, you must feel like Sisyphus doing a television series, right?
Yeah, what's the joke? It's a pie eating contest where the prize is more pie.
Yeah.
Now, the three of you on Homeland and Mad Men and Newsroom, obviously, you're riffing on things into consciousness in the news and on Mad Men and the historical record. How much do your scripts get altered to make sure that you are right about what you're writing about? Especially Homeland, I mean, it sort of entered the political debate as well.
Well, I remember at the beginning of last season, I take a pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. before every season to sit down with various active and retired CIA people and intelligence officers. And my number one question to them was, is Israel going to attack Iran? Is Netanyahu going to take out the nuclear sites? Not because I was concerned about world affairs necessarily, but more because that was how we were going to start our season, and I was terrified that either it was or it wasn't going to happen before we aired. So I needed to know definitively whether it was going to happen or not. And it was interesting, and the responses were not uniform. Some people said, absolutely he's going to attack. Other people said, absolutely not. It was a fascinating window into sort of the predictive nature of the intelligence community. But you know, if you're dealing in things that are happening, or you're trying to grok what's going on in the world, you know, you just have to be curious about what's going on in the world. You know, I mean, Howard, who I created the show with, I mean, we're crazy kind of, amateur foreign policy wonks, and, we read and we go to, Pacific Council meetings, and we try to talk to as many people as we can to get, what's right or what's going on in the halls of power. And the first season, what was very much being discussed in the intelligence community was this idea that, Obama had just been elected, or recently elected, and was completely and utterly putting the kibosh on any sort of enhanced interrogation techniques. And people were walking around, the agency saying, so wait a second, we can't get a little rough with people in the interrogation room, but we can fly a drone over their heads and kill them? There was a moral disconnect that people were feeling, and that very much influenced our first season. Obviously, I mean, how were we going to portray this issue? How are we going to ask the questions about the way that America projects its power overseas? And it was a big part of the first season.
On Newsroom, I mean, that show exhibits a close connection to the actual cable news universe. And
yeah, the Newsroom, we're doing historical fiction, recent history, and we don't invent any news at all. The only thing fictional in this show is that there is this other cable news channel, ACN, so when we're doing a real news story, and it's important, we've got to remind ourselves daily, we're not a news show. We're not doing the news. We're doing a show about people who do the news. There's, like I said, we won't make up any news. If Anwar al-Awlaki was killed on a Thursday and I need for him to have been killed on a Friday, and it's not upsetting the apple cart in any other way, I don't mind making that change. The more important thing that you've got to keep your eye on is leveraging hindsight to make your characters more heroic. And when I do that, I pay the price for it. And you've got to be careful not to do it. In other words, we're in this script that I haven't started writing yet, which somehow we'll be shooting the week after next. Benghazi is right there on the calendar. Benghazi is going to happen. I don't know yet. I can't tell you what this episode is going to be about, but I can tell you that Benghazi is going to happen in it. Now, we know now a lot more about Benghazi than they would have known when it first came over the Wire report, when the first iNews beep happened. And it'd be very easy to make these characters geniuses by having them figure it all out before anybody else was able to. You're not allowed to do that. What's the best reaction from someone in the cable news business that you've received to Newsroom? we've gotten a lot of great reactions from people in the cable, in the entire news business, cable, network, print, online. It's really been wonderful, and mostly to say one way or another that as cynical as we are about the news today, there are people, a lot of them in the news business, for whom the fire hasn't gone out. You know, that they really see it as a calling and that they really are trying to do the news well in the face of all sorts of corporate and commercial concerns that didn't exist decades ago, but that they really are trying hard.
Any reaction from Fox News?
None to me directly. But my guess is that they're not happy with the show because they perceive it as leaning left.
We sadly only have time for one more question, something a little bit lighter and more fun. If you could write for any other show on television besides your own, what would it be? Would it be comedy or drama?
I would say probably Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Why?
Because we love the show.
And Rob loves your show too.
We're mutual love in.
How about you, Matthew?
Well, 30 Rock's gone. I would have loved to have worked there. I love It's Always Sunny. I don't know. You know, I watch a lot of TV, so it's. I would like to write for The Simpsons. I have to say.
You've been Simpsons, haven't you?
I have.
Yeah.
I have. But it's mystifying to me. There's a kind of purity to what goes on over there that I'm impressed with, and it's so entertaining. And my kids would watch it and not say, "Daddy, what's wrong with you?"
How about you, Alex?
You know, we share a floor with New Girl. And so when we're in the story room talking about, you know, how a suicide vest could malfunction, or when a suicide vest goes, you know, the top of your head blows off and usually the head remains intact. And they're down the hallway talking about Schmidt and whether or not you can break a penis or not. I'm thinking I'd like to be in that room.
When I was on The Sopranos, the Sex and the City was right next door. And I had come from Half Hour. The Sopranos was the first drama I ever worked on. I'd worked in a comedy room for like 7 or 8 years. And I remember visiting 2 of the writers, the team there, when they were shooting, and they were doing one of those things where Carrie was at the computer and the camera was moving around, and she was thinking about her story and stuff like that. And they looked at me and they're like, "Well, there's not much to see here." And I said, "Well, I have to go back inside and shoot a 70-year-old man in the face." So I enjoyed this right now. I this is like a nice change.
Liz is a dear friend of mine, by the way, and she's constantly, you know, thinking about different ways penises can break off in her regular life too. So
on the show and out of the show.
I have to name 2 shows that are no longer around, but hopefully Netflix will bring them back the way they have with the rest of development. One would be Deadwood, and the other would be The Wire, both of which are masterpieces. And I think 100 years from now, when people are writing about TV the way they write about film, I mean, those are the Citizen Kane and the rules of the game of television. They're extraordinary, and I would have given anything to be a fly on the wall on either of those sets or in those rooms.
I'd be honored to get staffed up at any of these shows run by these guys. I think that for me, The Office is one of the best half hours in a long, long time. It's coming to an end this season. I would love to be on Parks and Rec, but I'm worried I would ruin it. I'm too big a fan as an audience member that I'm worried I wouldn't live up to it. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't mind writing an episode of Girls.
You stole my answer.
Take your answer?
You took my answer only because that's the soundstage we shoot next to in New York, is the Girls soundstage, and I just see that coming and going, and the sets in and out and the actors, and I'm like, boy, wouldn't that just be fun?
Yeah.
I'd like to write comedy because I feel like that's the one thing I'll never be hired for, is something comedic, like, you know, Friends or Seinfeld or something fun and light, but that's just not my life. Or I'd like to go back in time and be a staff writer on The West Wing.
Oh, please do, God.
And learn from this man, and maybe, you know. No.
All right, thank you guys.
Thanks very much.
We'll do the photo and then we're done.
Thank you, my brother.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. My great pleasure.